I think that we should reconsider, sit down, discuss the whole thing again, and see how we can move forward.
The struggle for truth in South Africa, is it only reinforcing the divisions? Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Jane Dutton. 13 years since the end of apartheid in South Africa, 9 since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission set up to heal its racial divisions, presented its last report. But a trial last week, seen as a witch hunt by many white South Africans, sparked fears that reconciliation could be blown apart. Is this the first of many such cases? If so, what is their purpose? Lucy Ashton has this report.
South Africa's vicious political past. The years of apartheid, the years of violence, and the years of murder on both sides. Forgiveness was always going to be hard. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up to try and ease that pain. A place where past sins could be confessed and forgiven. The only rule was that everybody must tell the truth. The first step was to find out who killed who. The aim was not to imprison the guilty. Those who confessed were pardoned. But the idea was that if the country could face its brutal past, then a new South Africa could emerge. Nevertheless, many refused to attend, including former President F.W. de Klerk. His Law and Order Minister, Adrian Vlok, did appear, but crucially failed to mention his attempt to murder prominent black activist Frank Chikane. Last week, that decision came back to haunt him. Vlok became the only senior politician from the white regime to be convicted of apartheid-era crimes. He won't be going to prison, though. A plea bargain deal ensured his sentence was suspended. That verdict was not as controversial as the trial itself, though. Outside the courtroom were two groups. Those who think the former white rulers are quite literally getting away with murder, that justice is yet to be done. And those who see this new trial as a political witch hunt. They want to know if the government will now try the killers of white civilians too. With future prosecutions likely, many are asking, is the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission now in vain? And fear there is a real danger of reopening old wounds with terrible consequences for all South Africans, black or white.
Well, joining me now to discuss this further in Johannesburg is Matthews Phosa, a lawyer and former ANC chairperson. Also in Johannesburg, Alana Bailey from the civil rights movement AfriForum, and in Pretoria, Yasmin Suka, former commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mr. Phosa, if I can start with you and talking about the case of Adrian Vlok and his co-accused, do you think justice was done?
Let's just start with the basics. I'm a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, currently serving. Justice was done in the case of Mr. Vlok and the others who appeared with him. The process of freedom is a process, not an event. The process of reconciliation is a process, not an event. The South African people have accepted that we will not have Nuremberg trials, but we will face the truth about the past. There are people who did not turn up for the amnesty process under the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They had a golden opportunity to appear there and make statements. But we must salute those who did appear, but there are those who didn't. Parliament met and passed regulations and guidelines, and all the political parties in Parliament agreed on those guidelines. And it's in terms of those guidelines that Mr. Vlok and his colleagues appeared before the court within the legal framework of our country, and that's what we have at the moment agreed by all political parties. As to whether or not it's a perfect process, it's an open question, but we think it's a fair process.
Ms. Suka, the fact that Adrian Vlok was one of the few to come forward, do you think it was right that he had to face trial?
Well, I think he had two opportunities when he could have made a proper disclosure about all the events within his knowledge. When he failed to do so, and I think really waited to be found out. I think it's absolutely appropriate that the law should take its course, and that was certainly the underlying premise of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think all of us accept that you know, it's a political compromise. We accept the fact that in normal international law, you prosecute those who commit human rights violations. And I think what we must remember, that Mr. Vlok and his colleagues have been responsible for committing really egregious violations, most of which in other countries would send you to jail for a very long time.
Ms. Bailey, are you and your forum equally satisfied?
AfriForum feels that the victims of human rights violations in South Africa have the right to the truth. But we also feel very strongly that in accordance with Article 9(1) of the Constitution, that all parties should be treated equal in the eyes of the law. And so far we've seen only one prosecution, whereas on both sides in the apartheid years there were human rights violations and atrocities committed, and we would like to know whether the rest of the process is going to treat all committers of violence equally, or whether Vlok has been singled out with his four colleagues for selective kind of morality, which we see now.
Okay, let's bring in the plea bargain that was entered, Ms. Suka. Part of the plea bargain was that Adriaan Vlok was to come up with names. He's only come up with one name. Do you think that's fair, and do you think it's the foot soldiers that will now take the blame of their leaders?
Well, I think the plea bargain process is not a very satisfactory one, and certainly if one looks at the kind of language in the plea bargain, as a victim and a black South African, I am deeply offended by the notion that we are talking about the fact that they committed atrocities against ordinary South Africans as if they were conducting a war against people who were equal on the other side. In reality, the South African conflict was that of the former state unleashed against its ordinary citizens, and I think that that's already a problematic issue. Then I have real problems with the fact that there's just been one name, and from my perspective, what one should remember is that in the Truth Commission, however flawed the process, in a way, full disclosure was extracted through a cross-examination process, through parties on all sides canvassing whether they were actually getting a full disclosure. In this particular instance, we have an admission by Mr. Vlok and his colleagues, but it's an untested one. And already we have one of the main persons named in that document disputing that, the veracity of what's in the plea bargain. And so I think the process itself of the plea bargain, the fact that it doesn't take place in public, there's no cross-examination, I think that leaves a lot to be desired and is going to lead to problems certainly in the future.
Okay, let's see if the Truth Commission and Reconciliation Commission has achieved what it set out to achieve. It was set up in 1995. Its task was to investigate political crimes committed by both supporters and opponents of apartheid. Led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Commission held public hearings across the nation for 3 years. Now, key to the Commission's work was its power to grant amnesties to perpetrators. But to receive that amnesty, the defendant had to fully disclose their actions and prove that their acts were politically motivated. Of the 7,000 applications received, over 5,000 were rejected. I mean, Ms. Suka, that's inevitable. This court case is inevitable, considering that the amnesty applications given under the TRC wouldn't stand up to international scrutiny.
Well, I think that, this is a huge question, of course, today in international law, whether the South African amnesty would pass muster. And I think generally international law lawyers agree that it will, simply because the matter was an open one. Victims were allowed to be represented. They could cross-examine the amnesty applicants. And at the end of the day, judges chaired these hearings. It was not an empty blanket process as in many other countries. But I think one of the things we need to recognize is that when the Truth Commission completed its work, it actually handed over a list of more than 300 names to the National Prosecutorial Authority and indicated that these were cases that needed to be investigated with a view to prosecutions. And this is very similar to steps followed in other countries, Chile, Argentina, and many other countries where truth commissions have been held. I think the big problem, of course, is that the NPA has taken such a long time to get to this point. But one must remember that there are thousands of victims in our country who have no knowledge about what happened to loved ones. And so it's very important that we have a process which begins to establish the truth about what happened in the past.
Mr. Phoza, do you think the victims will be appeased with what they've seen in the last couple of weeks?
Well, very clearly they will not, and that's exactly why it is important to go through some of these processes and not try and avoid them, because some people think it's a witch hunt. It's not a witch hunt, it's an attempt to try and address the truth. And in a political environment, given the history where we came from, there will be no perfect solution. I would like to see one country where there was a struggle, where there's a perfect solution. There will never be a perfect solution. We're just trying to say, within the framework of our law, let's try and complete the work which was started by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I want to assure the world that everyone will be treated equally. It's not a question of the government of the ANC going for those who were perpetrating violations under apartheid. But even if there are people on the side of the liberation movement who are guilty of human rights violations, they will still appear before the courts. We went to TRC as the leadership of the ANC, and we took collective responsibility, because we think it's cowardly for political leadership not to take responsibility for what happened.
Okay,
So
we're going to be
look at
talking
it.
about just that after the break. And I'll also be asking our guests about the future of the national reconciliation in South Africa. Can it hold together? Stay with us.